started as a more or less as a Facebook post where Wes posted a meme about how the film industry and theaters in particular were dying. And this actually tied into some of the research that I'm doing that looks at how digital releases versus physical releases in the film industry are working. And then obviously the COVID era is making this already tense problem even more dramatic. And Brenna had said, hey, the same thing is happening in fashion. And I was like, also maybe video games. And so we kind of thought we could arrange a series of talks around the idea of kind of issues or conundrums in creative industries that COVID has either exacerbated or kind of shined a light on in a way that otherwise we wouldn't have seen. Now, when I was thinking about this problem and kind of figuring out what I wanted to talk about today, I kind of assumed that what everyone was thinking when they saw the title of this talk or when they were thinking through things was something along the lines of this, right? It's everybody still wants to go see the movies, but going to see the movies in the era of COVID is horrifying. No one wants to do it. Everyone's wearing masks. And so people, when they think, like, what's the issue? What's the problem with theaters in the COVID era? They're all like, well, it's COVID. People don't necessarily want to expose themselves to the virus. And so people attending theaters are dramatically down. You just have to look at, like, the box office revenue of Tenet this past weekend. It was fine. But $20 million is not what you expect for a Chris Nolan movie releasing in a prime time, lots of IMAX sort of thing. But then I started thinking about how this potentially related to some of my research, and I realized that really the problem for the theater industry actually looks a lot more like this. It's that all it takes is this poll going from 15% yes to 30 or 40% yes. And suddenly you have 6 major studios who are going to ask the question, do I ever need a theatrical release at all, right? The challenge that theaters are dealing with is less, I think, the short-term problem of people aren't showing up today, and more the long-term problem of how can I motivate people to continue showing up? And in particular, how do I motivate studios to actually continue wanting to show their films in theaters? And we've seen this problem kind of emerge over the past decade or two. And so here I've just kind of listed a number of things that I've identified as being really challenging for theaters and how cinematic distribution is changing. Now, first off, one thing that I want to note is that studios are aware that the value of theaters has been declining in the past decade or two. And so one of the ways that they've been trying to deal with this is by shrinking what's known as the exclusive distribution window. So generally speaking, when a studio decides they want to send their movies to theaters, what they do is they negotiate a contract that has a minimum number of weeks that the film will show in theaters, and also has a minimum number of weeks between when the movie is released and when it shows up on some sort of streaming service or on DVD or on any other form of distribution. And historically, the window between the release of a film in theaters and the release of the film in some other medium was something like 6 to 7 months. Nowadays, this number is closer to 2 or 3 months, and there have been anecdotal reports that studios like Disney have asked for something like 1 to 2 weeks, although studios haven't completely given into those demands yet. In addition to that, we're seeing that indie cinema and awards-based cinema is really moving increasingly online. We're seeing that independent theater chains are really starting to fall apart in a lot of cities and areas. It tends to be the 3 major players in the theater realm that are really being successful. We also are seeing that some theater chains are introducing subscription plans, right? Obviously, when we had the original, like, Movie Pass, that was a thing. I had one. It was wonderful. It wasn't remotely profitable. But AMC A-List seems to be quite profitable and has actually been a boon for AMC and other theater chains. And then finally, historically, you would make 80, 90% of your money in domestic markets when it comes to a theatrical release. Nowadays, that number might be 40 or 50%. And so all of these things are really putting just a bunch of pressure on theaters as far as how they're going to survive and what things are really causing problems well beyond the epidemic that we're currently in the middle of. Now, because of that, we have to ask the question, if people are moving away from theaters, do the alternatives actually work, right? Because we know that if you send your Star Wars movie to theaters, even a really bad Star Wars release might make $500 million in theaters, right? If you make an Avengers movie and it's somehow the world's worst Avengers movie, you're probably locked into $500, $600, $700 million just in the United States in theatrical release. And so in order for an alternative to theaters to be viable, there has to be at least some sense from studios that we can do as well as or better than theaters. And this is where my research really starts to come into this. Because as these new release strategies have emerged, one of the challenges that the casual observer can't easily tell whether or not studios are making as much money online as they would in theaters, right? And this is because theatrical revenues are announced, whereas online revenues aren't necessarily. It's because there are all sorts of new release strategies and the casual observer might not be completely aware of all of them. But probably the biggest difference is that the comparison is apples and oranges. Because right now, a different type of movie is showing up in theaters than the type of movies that are going online, right? If you are Disney and you make a new Avengers movie, you don't even for a second consider releasing it as a Disney Plus exclusive. That thing's going to theaters, you're going to make a few $100 million on opening weekend, right? And so because of that, it's really challenging if we observe the average movie in theaters makes X amount and the average movie that goes online makes Y amount. Well, that difference, how much of it is because the movie was in theaters versus online, as opposed to how much of that difference in revenue is simply because we had big budget blockbusters that were going in theaters and we were having more indie releases going online, right? Until we can separate those two things apart effectively, it's really difficult to evaluate how much of it is the medium and how much of it is the film itself. So I try to investigate this problem. I try to figure out exactly what's going on here. So what I have is I have data for the US box office for every movie that was released in theaters from 2014 to 2017. And then I only analyze movies that made at least $10,000 in box office revenue. Now, it's worth noting that is kind of an arbitrary cutoff, but why did I pick $10,000? Because that literally means you sold 1,000 tickets, maybe only 700 or 800 tickets. And so even a movie that gets a release on 3 screens could do that in a weekend, right? More or less what I'm excluding are movies that are like shown in someone's backyard and for some reason it gets counted as a theatrical release, or a movie that shows once at a festival and then never actually has like tickets directly sold. But everything else is included. Now, in addition to knowing how much money these movies made, I'm also able to observe how many theaters they were released in on opening weekend, and also how many theaters they were in every week of their release. So I can track whether a movie was a limited release that started small and stayed small, or whether it was a limited to wide, where it started small, got popular, and then was released in more places, or whether it was a true wide release, where on the first weekend, there were like 3,000 or 4,000 theaters that were showing the film. What do I use this to do? I use a technique called propensity score matching. And this is where I'm going to talk math for about 5 minutes in an Emerson talk, and I just assume the numbers are going to drop off of who's watching, and y'all can come back in a minute. It's fine. But propensity score matching is actually a technique that was developed in medicine. And the idea in the medical realm is you always want to have a control group and a group that's being treated. And the problem is, if what you're trying to do isn't test whether a medicine cures someone, but rather you're trying to test whether something dangerous kills someone, you can't exactly do a medical experiment where you give half of the people in your study cyanide and see what happens, right? That's not okay. And so what you do is you use a technique that's designed to find, if we have 2 distinct groups, in my case, movies that went to theaters and movies that went online, are there some parts of those groups that overlap in terms of their characteristics? Basically, what I want to do is first, I want to predict what movies do I think will end up online and what movies do I think will end up in theaters. Then, based on what characteristics cause a movie to go online or cause a movie to go in theaters, I want to find pairs of films that were equally likely to end up in theaters, but one of them did and one of them didn't. So ideally what I'm looking for here is I might say I have one movie that had a budget of $100 million, had one major star, had a director no one had heard of, isn't a sequel, and is a comedy. And then I find another movie with exactly those same characteristics, but one of them went to theaters and one of them went online. And if I can find enough pairs that look like that, then what I can do is in stage 3, I can ask the question, did the films in those pairs that went online make less money than the movies in those pairs that went into theaters? Because now what I'm doing is comparing the revenues of two groups, but I'm more or less controlling for the fact that movies that go to theaters are bigger, more popular movies. Because I'm not comparing an indie movie against the Avengers, I'm comparing an indie movie against another very similar indie movie. Does that make a reasonable amount of sense? Okay. Now I have a table with a bunch of numbers on it. Doesn't everyone love Emerson today? So the thing to note here is the first two columns. So the column on the left tells us what characteristics might have influenced the revenue of a film, and the second column tells us in percentage terms how much more or less money did a movie make if it had those characteristics. So, for example, when a movie was a wide release, it made approximately 26% more money than a movie that was not a wide release. Or if a movie was a comedy, it made approximately 27% more money than a movie that wasn't a comedy, right? So the main result that we care about here are the second and third rows, right? A wide release movie on average makes 26% more money than a non-wide release movie, even comparing apples to apples. And a movie that shows in more theaters, for each extra theater, makes 0.14% more money. Now that seems like a stupidly small amount, but when we think about the fact that we're sometimes comparing one movie that showed in 100 theaters versus another movie that showed in 3,100 theaters, when you take 0.14 and multiply it by 3,000, you're getting pretty dramatically higher revenues, right? Just like back of the envelope math, we might be doubling revenue between a really small release and a really big release in terms of the total number of theaters that it shows in. Right? And the other things make sense. Sci-fi movies tend to make more money. In part, this is because I really weirdly happened to find movies that matched a couple of the Star Wars movies as something similar went online. And so sci-fi is the one place where we have big blockbusters in the data set. But also, sci-fi is a big genre. And it also makes sense that unrated films would make significantly less. I don't think there's anything too controversial on this table. Ignore the right 3 columns unless you love math, in which case talk to me and we'll geek out about those right 3 columns for the rest of the hour. Hopefully this is still making a reasonable amount of sense. We're moving away from the math now.
Wait, I have a question.
Oh yeah.
It's not about the math per se, like I am interested, but I won't bore people. Did you account for things that were combinations of these categories? Like what if it was a wide release and a comedy, or a wide release and a sci-fi? Is there a combo of those, or were these just all completely separated?
So the way that this is measured is it measures how much does the revenue change if one of these categories change and nothing else does. So for example, if we compared, so for, let's say the comedy variable, it says that a comedy makes 27% more money than a non-comedy. What that tells us is that if we have one movie that is a wide release in 3,000 theaters, that's not a sci-fi, not a drama, and not unrated, and is a comedy, it will make 27% more than a movie that has all of the same other characteristics, but is not a comedy. So in theory, if the math is working correctly, these should actually be controlling for each other. So this should be what's the benefit of being a comedy if you have everything else the same. So when we have a combination, if we have one movie that's a wide release comedy and another movie that's a limited release non-comedy, you could theoretically add, or technically, because these are logs, multiply these numbers together, and you would end up with the amount that you would get from changing a combination of the things, right? So I don't have the combos directly listed here, but theoretically you could calculate them. Like roughly speaking, a wide release comedy would make about 53% more money than a film that was neither a wide release nor a comedy. So you can handle the combinations that way. Cool. Any other questions about this or what I did here? Now let's talk about why this is useful and what it tells us about that story we were telling earlier about the future of theaters and what exactly is going on here. So what do these results show us about the future of cinema? So first off, simultaneous releases or limited releases. So a simultaneous release is a movie that goes online on the same day that it goes into theaters. This is also known as a day and date release. And it's something that Amazon and Netflix have really been pushing for more and more of in the past few years. So those types of releases generate about 26% lower theatrical revenue than wide release films. But it's worth noting that if you use the same model and include some of the big budget blockbusters, that number actually gets dramatically larger. These estimates are way less reliable because the sample size that I'm working with is extremely small, but it's anywhere from 40 to 80% revenue drop off if you were to release, I would estimate, if you release something like an Avengers movie online, right? So if your typical like Avengers Endgame made $1 billion in the US, it could make as little as $200 million if you did like a Mulan style online release, according to some of the data that I'm looking at. It's also worth noting that there is some evidence that releasing in two markets simultaneously, so trying to go like on Amazon and in theaters on the same day, actually hurts revenues in both markets, right? So people are less likely to watch a film on Amazon if they convince themselves I need to see it in theaters, and people are less likely to watch a movie in theaters if they say I am going to watch it on Amazon. And in fact, the significance that I get on this measurement is really small, but I do find some evidence that there's almost like an indecision problem for people who have the option to see a movie both online and in person, where there's some evidence that people will say, I really want to see Roma in theaters, and then when they don't, they feel bad enough that they then don't see it on Amazon, right? The revenue drop-off is pretty small, but it does exist. Now, the reason why I note this is because it really kind of, I think, makes the future of movie theaters really stark. Because it means that there are more or less two classes of film, right? There are small independent pictures that don't need theatrical release that say we're going to make 26% less in theaters if we do a simultaneous release, but who cares? We own the rights. We can do them online and in theaters simultaneously. Roma is obviously still the biggest, most prominent example of this strategy working, right? Netflix was able to get fairly good viewership numbers in theaters, and there's some evidence that there is some ad campaigns that can take advantage of this strategy. So Roma, for example, ran a bunch of ads on Netflix that were like, here's Netflix, watch it now, and then at the end of the ad, it was like, you need to see it in theaters. And there's some evidence that people were actually like watching it on Amazon and then like, maybe I do need to see it in theaters. On the other hand, there are some movies where online will never, ever, 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 ever work, right? If you're going to go from $1 billion to, at best, 600 million for an Avengers film, not a thing, right? And this problem, I think, is further articulated when we ask the question, why don't other distribution methods work for blockbusters, right? Why can't Disney Plus be the new home of something like the Avengers franchise? Well, if we look at something like Netflix, they are a firm that has the single largest production budget of any of the streaming services, right? It's not quite as big as like Disney as a studio as a whole, but if you're thinking people who are all digital, Netflix is spending something like $15.3 billion a year to make original content. And that's an insane number, right? And in fact, there's some evidence that Netflix lost money for close to a decade because they spent so much more on acquisition and production than they were actually able to bring in terms of revenue. Now, why does that matter? Because a film like Star Wars might cost something like $500 million to make and market. And that means if you want to make something like Disney does, 8 or 9 tentpole films per year, Netflix would have to spend literally half of their budget just on those 8 or 9 films. And that's super problematic from their business model, right? Netflix really relies on having volume, on having a wide variety of products, and that doesn't really work. And then just some simple back of the envelope math. If Netflix spends 13 million, or if Netflix charges $13 per customer, that means that a Star Wars movie would need to have 31 million new subscribers just to break even. And that just doesn't seem possible, even if we assume that a Star Wars movie can generate new subscribers over 3 or 4 months, right? It just feels not viable. And so this, I think, is the saving grace of theaters. If we ask, is it game over? Are theaters dying in the era of COVID? My answer is not as long as people keep seeing Avengers movies, right? As long as there is a market for films that cost almost $1 billion to make, theaters are the only viable way, unless there is some new technological innovation that people are willing to spend $15 to see a movie at home. But as Mulan illustrates, as Tenet seems to illustrate, as our early days of COVID digital releases seem to show, it seems really difficult that a movie like Black Widow is ever going to get released without some sort of theatrical backing, because Disney's just afraid of the amount of revenue that's potentially coming in from that sort of circumstance. So, what does the future of theaters actually look like in this case? Well, first off, I think one thing that's really worth noting is that there has to be an increased focus on like the summer tentpoles, the big blockbusters. There may only be 1 or 2 movies that really need to go to theaters in any given week. As opposed to right now, you might see 6, 7, 8 releases in a typical week in the summer of movies that are going to their theatrical release. Now, this probably means that the days of the megaplex are significantly more numbered than the days of the more modern, fewer screens, but more amenities theaters, right? I think the theater in the Fenway, if you've been to like the Regal Fenway, where they have much smaller screens, but they're higher quality and you can buy beer and dinner, that's probably a much more viable model because you can end up getting away with having 5 screens that can show the big blockbusters rather than having 15 screens, some of which have to be dedicated to smaller fare. I think there's also something to be said here for how much concessions are really driving the revenue of theater chains. And so one of the things that these theaters need to recognize is that it's really imperative for them in this digital age to have a way of saying you'd rather watch the movie here than watch it anywhere else. And things like AMC A-List really prove that you can make money more or less giving away tickets for free as long as people are buying a $12 tub of popcorn on their way into the theater, right? And then finally, and I think this is the most interesting development we might talk about, is the fact that in the past year and a half, let's say, both Netflix and Amazon have bought movie theaters. And this is interesting for 2 reasons. First off, because it may paint a picture of what the future of theaters might look like in terms of some form of vertical integration, where the only small independent movies that end up in theaters rather than online are ones that are ending up in theaters owned by the company who made the movie, right? So the most famous example of this is the picture I have here. Netflix bought the Paris Theater in New York because they were worried about it going under, and they immediately used it as the launching point for Marriage Story because in order to qualify for Oscars, they needed to show the movie in theaters for 1 week. But it's also worth noting that as of the mid-1960s, it is extremely illegal for a company that makes movies to own movie studios. The Paramount decision was a Supreme Court decision that explicitly outlawed vertical integration between movie studios and movie theaters. And so the fact that Amazon and Netflix buying these theaters didn't create a Federal Trade Commission or FEC challenge, and actually these mergers went through with basically no issues, may actually signal that there is a change in perception in the judiciary around whether or not vertical integration is allowed and is something that is a viable business strategy for larger studios than Netflix or Amazon. Because now, if someone like Disney decides to try to buy someone like AMC, there's obviously going to be a court battle about that, but the courts aren't going to be able to decide simply based on no film company has been allowed to buy a theater in 60 years, because two of the biggest film companies in the world were allowed to buy theaters in the past year and a half. And so there may be some question about whether or not increasing vertical integration may actually be the saving grace of the theater industry, where they may be able to reduce some of the costs of acquiring movies if someone like a Disney or an Amazon decides to buy a major theater and funnels all of their movies at low or no cost through that distribution venue. That was me talking for a solid like 25 minutes, 30 minutes. Yay. Now is a good time for questions and answers, because if I hit my space bar again, we will end up seeing the end of presentation thing. So what are people's thoughts? What are people's questions? What do you want to add as far as this discussion goes?
If no one has anything right away, I actually got a question that got sent in from someone who can't make it and will be watching the recording. So you kind of touched on this a little, but Harry basically asked if you think that with the rise of instantly streamable movies, there'll be more companies like coming in to like compete with the theaters. So like, I think he's trying to ask like, if he thinks like Netflix is gonna like you did kind of touch on this, like buy a theater. So like, I wonder now if like, will something like if you touched on this with the Avengers thing too, it's like for those movies, like you said, will never be like available to make their profit streamable unless they like maybe create their own sort of streaming service where you can only get like, you pay like $50 a month, but you access these movies. Like, do you think that's like a feasible thing that could happen? I think is what he's trying to touch on.
I more or less see like 3 or 4 viable long run outcomes for this market, right? One is the outcome that I'm predicting here based on the data I have, which is like long live the theater. They might be smaller, they might rely more on tentpoles, but they're gonna last, right? Option 2 was always what we're now forever going to know as the Mulan option, right? Can you get someone to pay $30 to stream a movie early? The answer based on Mulan seems to be no, but at least I think there's the possibility that that perception changes in the future, right? Option 3 would be some sort of new technology, right? Whether that's some sort of VR-based cinema service that people feel more content to pay $30 for rather than streaming. They seem to think the price point is more like $5 or $10. But there needs to be some technology that can justify a $15 plus buy per movie. Or like you suggest, a streaming service that is $60 a month, but contains wide release movies, right? That's more or less the approach that MoviePass took, right? They said, we're gonna have a subscription, it's $20 or $30 a month, but you get unlimited movie tickets. And MoviePass died a horrible death, right? Now, why is AMC A-List working when MoviePass didn't? It's because they can lose money on tickets, but make money on popcorn, and that means that their subscription is profitable. And so I think in order for a streaming service like the one that you propose, where it's like $40 or $50 or $60 a month, in order for that to be viable, there needs to be something other than the movies tied into it that will make people pay that extra price. Because until you do, I feel like AMC A-List just trumps a service like that, and AMC is pretty content to make money on popcorn. I saw Sanjay's hand a minute ago, and then I can answer Bhamati's question in the chat and can get to others.
Yeah, hey, Tyler, really interesting talk, thanks. My question is, you talked about these tent poles and you're spending a lot of money and it's got to go to theatrical to recoup the dollars. What's the margin on those tent poles versus the Netflix margins? I'm just curious on the net margins of the two different models.
So the average margin is actually pretty similar across both models. We don't have exact figures because Hollywood is really good at hiding exactly what their costs are really deep in their financial reporting. That being said, by most accounts, a really successful movie is one that doubles the expense, and a truly failed movie is one that makes pretty close to negative $200 or $300 million. In terms of percentage, you're probably looking at, on average, a typical movie is probably only turning over something like a 10 or 15% margin. That being said, the benefit of a tentpole is that that expected margin is relatively secure, whereas for indie films, the expected margin is almost the same as the expected margin for a blockbuster, but the variance might be 10 times as large. Where for an indie film, you're much more likely to have 10 films that make $0 and one film that makes a couple $100 million and makes the other 10 profitable. Whereas for blockbuster films, they all tend to be slightly profitable, but you tend to be less likely to have a movie that earns 100 times its budget. And so honestly, for studios like Disney or Universal or like the major studios, the big budget blockbuster isn't necessarily around because it's significantly higher margin. It's around because it's their insurance policy on all of the risks they're taking on other films. You can more or less lock in an Avengers movie for a pretty good return.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So Bhamati popped a question into the chat. So she says, how does movie content differ from other creative or content product? And I think the answer to that question is that I think the big difference is exactly what Sanjay identifies, which is that if we're looking at independent cinema, I think there's not a huge difference in terms of content creation and risk management from what you see in other industries. What makes the film industry unique relative to something like music or relative to something like theater is that the fixed costs are just astronomical in the industry. And they're fixed costs that in many cases have to be paid 2 or 3 years prior to the release of a film. And so unlike something like the music industry, where one of the solutions to digitization was to dramatically reduce the cost of production, that doesn't seem to be a viable option in the film industry. And so this is why I think the music story, if you were looking at like music in their response to digitization, their answer has been like cheaper, 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 cheaper. And that's not a story that necessarily works quite as well in the film industry. Now, as to your second question, why not just vertically integrate? The answer historically is that the Supreme Court made it illegal. But nowadays, the applicability of that isn't necessarily true. We'll need to see exactly how courts interpret the way that Amazon is now acquiring theaters and Netflix is acquiring theaters. But historically, like even some of the students have lived in the Paramount building. That's called the Paramount because it was originally a theater that was owned by the Paramount Film Company. And in the 1960s, they had to divest from it because the Supreme Court ruled that there was too much monopoly power generated by studios being able to offer exclusive deals to the theaters that they own. I see Mel's hand, and I'll try to scroll through other faces to see if anybody else has hands up. But go ahead, Mel.
I had a question based on like the different streaming services. So you talked a lot about like Netflix and Amazon, but Hulu bases a lot of their profits on ads. So getting more people to watch would actually make them very profitable. So do you think Hulu has like a better advantage for going more digital than in theaters because they do have that extra like revenue stream, which is just you have to watch an ad at the beginning of a movie and sometimes at the end, and that just gets them a lot of money. I think last year someone said it was like $1 billion worth of ad revenue for the whole year. And so like I noticed you never mentioned Hulu, and Hulu does have original, like Palm Springs was one of the indie movies they just put up in the summer.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of the answer is that it's very similar to something like when we look at professional sports, right? So professional sports, very similar to film, is an extremely expensive upfront cost to acquire, right? ESPN pays something like $1 billion a year to get rights to the NFL. And the problem is that in order to justify those sorts of expenses, you really do need to have more or less the quantity of ads that you see on television, right? You need an ad break about once every 5 minutes that's a minute or two long. That's the quantity of ads that you would need to make ad-based film even close to profitable, right? And imagine the challenge of telling someone, we want you to watch a Star Wars movie, but you're gonna have to watch 3 minutes of ads every 5 minutes, right? Or if you want to do the Hulu plan and front load ads, you'd probably need to have like an hour of front loaded ads before you started the movie. This is not to say that Hulu doesn't have a unique advantage in terms of price discrimination, because Hulu in the past few years has actually made more money off of their lower paying subscribers who watch ads than they have off of their higher paying subscribers who skip ads, right? The difference in price is like $5 or $10 in subscription fees, and Hulu brings in more than $5 or $10 in ad revenue. The challenge is if we're talking about like theaters have the added ad revenue of popcorn that makes it justifiable for them to charge 15 a head instead of 30 a head. With Hulu, if you want to do ads, we might be talking like an hour to an hour and a half of ads in a typical blockbuster film, and that just feels like something people aren't going to do even if it's free. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts?
Quick question, if I can. What do you think? You went through tent poles and looking at all those, but what do you think about rumors that for example, Disney's looking at maybe moving Soul to Disney Plus? Do you think that would have the same effect with profit, or do you think animation and family would be different? Even though I know Mulan, which you could consider family, really didn't quite land.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about my data set is that there are a shockingly large number of animated kids movies that get released either direct online or some form of simultaneous release. And we actually find that it doesn't have a super different effect than what we see with our typical like 26% drop off. So my guess is that something like Soul, if it may have had, I'm just like eyeballing based on what I've heard about that movie and like consensus. It's a Pixar movie. I'm guessing they were targeting something in like the $300 to $400 million total domestic range. Based on my data, I would say they'd probably at best be pulling in something like 150 to 250 on a streaming service. Now, is that a disaster? No. Animated movies tend to be a bit cheaper to produce if you're not pushing the limit in the way that Pixar sometimes does. If they're using, for example, a lot of the same programmers and coding that they use on Inside Out, there may be cost advantages there where it's not nearly as daunting as like a true tentpole. And there's obviously some evidence that kids will watch a movie 800 times over and over and over again on a streaming service, so they might be slightly more reliable customers than your typical person who might sign up for Disney Plus, watch a movie once, and then cancel their subscription at the end of the month. So I think it's definitely a more viable model, but if you're going to leave, say, $100 million on the table by releasing something like Soul on Disney Plus, you're going to need to have a pretty good reason why you're able to do that. And this, actually, to bring it back to what Mel talked about, may mean that the Hulu model is really effective for mid-size films where you can attach 10 ads plus a fee, rather than a big film where you'd have to attach 50 ads plus a fee. So there may actually be some viability there, although of course people like Disney have said there will never be ads. So we're still figuring that out.
Do you think there are other, I guess, avenues for monetization besides ads or an incredibly large price tag on top of the price of the streaming service?
The one thing that I'm really curious to see someone try is bundling, right? If I am Disney and I am terrified of what just happened with Mulan, what I say is my next release, whether it's Soul or whatever other semi-big movie I decide is going to release online, rather than offering it for $30, I offer it for $50 and I include a stuffed animal and 2 toys. Right? And I can manufacture those toys for less than $5. Shipping is super cheap. And suddenly I might be able to get people it with exclusive merchandise, right? I suspect it's a really hard sell to tell someone you've got to pay $30 to stream Star Wars, but I'll bet if you told someone you've got to pay $100 to stream Star Wars and we'll send you a 3D printed Stormtrooper helmet, I would buy like 8, right? So I think that someone has to tap into non-digital revenue streams as a way of augmenting digital products as one way that I might look at moving things forward. But you're always going to run into the traditional price discrimination problem of you'll get people to actually buy it, but you'll have fewer numbers. And right now, theaters are a volume game more than they are a margin game. So it's a little 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but that's the first thing that jumps to my mind.
Thank you. That's a fascinating answer.
Any other thoughts or questions? I have Bamathi and then September.
Do you think there's going to be an effect on content? The content themselves?
That's a good question. My short answer is my guess is there is probably more of an effect on content quantity than content quality. And I say that largely because of a bunch of other papers I've read from other people about the benefit of for whatever reason, there seems to be a line in the sand of if your budget is more than $200 million, people perceive your film as real. And if your budget is less than 200 million, you actually have to have slightly higher percentage of your budget go to marketing or else you're going to struggle in many cases. So my suspicion is that unlike, say, the music industry where the answer was quality drops off because we can record at home instead of recording in a giant studio, I think if anything drops off, it's more likely something to do with the quantity of films produced, right? Disney might feel confident in 2 Marvel movies a year rather than 4 if theatrical release continues to decline. But that's me spitballing based on data I've seen significantly more than it is the analysis I've done.
Yeah, like more of the same. Like, look, so you've got very high fixed costs and you've got to make more content and you possibly have a smaller piece of the pie.
Right.
So you make more stuff that you just pretty much know is going to sell, like Superman 5000 and 5000 A and B, and I mean just like spin-offs of the same spin-off so that you don't take appreciable risks.
Or at least the risks you take tiny risks, right?
Yeah.
I think to some degree, I think some of the answer to this is Blumhouse, right? If you're, Blumhouse Studios, they're a studio that's famous for making micro-budget horror films. So what they do is they make 100 movies a year, and those movies have a budget of like $5,000 each, right? And of those 100 movies they make, 2 of them will be successful. But if one of those 2 successful movies becomes Insidious and you can make $800 million sequels to it, that's what you're looking for, right? So I think what you do if you are Disney is you start making a bunch of really bad sci-fi movies, and the one that people get excited about, you turn it into your next Star Wars and you churn out 18 of them, right? But the difference is you no longer want to do what Disney did in the mid-2000s. You no longer want to take a chance on establishing a franchise by spending $300 million because John Carter of Mars was a really bad movie, right? And that's what I think you need to avoid more and more as the theatrical kind of revenue as a percentage of what you're bringing in potentially shrinks because of all of the digital pressures. September, I saw you had a question.
Yeah, so something that Mel's question kind of made me think about a little bit is how are movie theater previews, which are considered like a form of advertisements, comparing to ad revenue on sites like Hulu, and like how do they compare and how are they different? And when we talk about like the sustainability of movie theaters, is that another form of revenue that you're like thinking would help keep them alive?
So this is actually another paper I'm writing. I have another like 20 pages of analysis I could do if you really wanted me to. The shortest answer I can give is that when you think about the ads that show before theaters, you can usually divide them into 3 chunks. There are the ads that show before the showtime of the movie. And this is where you get like Pepsi ads or where you get like car ads. Those are a new form of revenue for theaters, but based on the few people I've interviewed who work in the theater industry, they're kind of tapped out on it. They've been asking for higher and higher fees for those, and it seems like they kind of reach the most they can ask for and still get people to commit to an ad when not everyone's in the theater, right? Now, once the showtime starts, the first previews you see aren't paid for, they are attached by the movie theater. So very frequently when you see ads that are like the first like 4 or 5 ads before a movie, those are going to be movies that are released in the next few weeks that the movie theater thinks if we show this ad, we'll get another ticket sale 2 weeks from now. And then usually the last couple ads that you see before a movie are actually attached by the studio who produced the movie. And showing those ads isn't a revenue generator for theaters, it's actually a requirement by the studio for distributing the movie. And historically, the way that movie theaters did this is they would like physically include the trailers on the reel of film that had the movie on it. So you couldn't show the movie without showing the trailer. So it's actually previews are a significantly smaller revenue generator than you would probably expect. They're almost all either free advertising for the theater or free advertising for the studio. But it may be something to consider whether theaters might have some way of like allowing 1 or 2 paid ads after the showtime, and whether that might generate more revenue than the ads before the showtime because the person paying for the ad knows, hey, everyone's already in their seats. They don't want to miss part of the movie. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions? It looks like we've maybe got like 10 more minutes, or we can head out early, whatever works best for you. I see Bhamathi unmuted herself.
So I know, sorry, Tyler, this is too interesting, bummer, huh? I don't want to keep people, no, what, can you talk about how, a little tiny bit about how international, so international's now becoming huger and huger, right? And I assume it changes the windows of release because, you know, increased opportunities for arbitrage of locations or piracy or whatever. Where does that fit into this, your fascinating story, Tyler?
Yeah, so there are 2 or 3 really interesting aspects internationally. So one is that international distribution is usually negotiated separately from domestic distribution. And so for smaller films, there's actually a unique thing that happens where they may contract with a US firm for US distribution, but will contract with a completely different firm to determine their distribution internationally. So those contracts are actually A, significantly more cloudy. No one knows exactly what they look like, whereas US distribution contracts, we have the data. And 2, they vary so much more that it's a lot harder to draw big conclusions about how things are shifting in the digital age because we don't quite know exactly what that looks like. But the question you ask about release windows is spot on, because historically the US release window came first, and then the international release window would come later once the studios knew how viable a film was and thus knew what rates to charge international distributors. The problem nowadays is that digital piracy is so easy that once a movie is in theaters in the US, that means it's online in other countries. The really fascinating thing that has started to happen is that because distribution internationally is often handled by different companies than distribution in the US, we have now actually seen some examples of movies that got theatrical releases in the States, but got all digital releases in other countries. And The best example of this from the past couple of years, did y'all see the movie Booksmart? A, do, it's really good. But B, Booksmart was a Netflix original movie in every country in the world except the US. And there's actually some evidence that Booksmart had a much lower domestic release because people found ways of either masking their IP location, and so they were able to stream Booksmart internationally, or people just put bootlegged copies of the Netflix version online. And when you bootleg something off Netflix, it's way higher quality than bootlegging something off a theater screen. So now there's actually a move in the film industry to try to centralize distribution always within one company that handles both domestic and international distribution, because the problem is there have now been some examples of international release windows coming before domestic release windows, and it actually has a pretty big effect on domestic box office revenue.
You don't encrypt it differently?
You try, but it doesn't work especially well from all accounts, right? The problem is if you have some really fascinating encryption that lets you block 99.999% of hackers, that means one dude online can ruin your box office, right? And it's an arms race, right? I've done a lot of work on anti-piracy policy internationally, and it's literally like every year we come up with some new form of DRM or some new form of solving the problem, and then 6 months later someone cracks it. Like, there just isn't a long-term way of keeping, once it's on someone's screen, it's on everyone's screen these days.
The thing with Booksmart is so interesting because I saw it in theaters and I love that movie, but I had no idea that it was like a Netflix original movie in other countries. I guess but going like kind of back and like slightly off topic right now, the part where you were showing like the different percentages of like, oh, they know comedy movies have a 20% high or whatever, make more, reminded me of my roommate's internship right now is super interesting, and I feel like if you haven't heard of it, you'd be like fascinated by it. It's the guy who started Pandora is trying to make a Pandora for movies.
Okay.
And so she's working on like a genome project with like 100 other film students where they just watch a bunch of movies and like analyze them and categorize them a ton so that they can like genome all the movies and then like create like they're trying to create like a Pandora for thing like for movies is like their concept, but she's like she feels like she's just giving them a bunch of data and they're just gonna like sell all the data back to production companies. And that's probably what it's gonna end up being like on the back end where the company's really gonna make money. But like the concept of a Pandora for movies is interesting too.
Yeah, and in fact, to some degree, that was actually what MoviePass, their original plan was, is their thought wasn't we're gonna make money off our service. Their thought was we're gonna lose a little money on our service, and then we're gonna have the world's greatest data on theater attendance, and AMC will pay us billions for it. And AMC just said, haha, we can get this data ourselves, right? But I think it's the same sort of question, right? Because Netflix is so good at this, right? They're not a Pandora for movies, but they're a really good Spotify for movies, right? Every time you log on to Netflix, every one of those like things that's like horror movies that make you laugh, right? That is something that they mined from a bunch of people assigning categories to movies, and they think that's what you want. And so,
can you explain that distinction? I'm not quite sure. I get the distinction.
Yeah, so when it came to music, Pandora was a service where you don't get to choose the next song. You get to choose a song, and then it's like radio. It plays follow-up songs based on what it thinks your preferences are. And you could click thumbs up or thumbs down. And if you thumbs down something, it would skip it, but then you didn't pick the next song, it would just play the next song, right? Spotify, on the other hand, if you want to, you can choose every song you listen to in order. You can create your own playlist, right?
You're talking about that model, not the difference in like the algorithms that actually.
Right, yeah. The algorithms, honestly, they're big data, they're black boxes, they're all the same, right? But I think the question is, can you come up with an AI that's better than Amazon's AI? If you can, that's $1 billion idea. And if you can't, what you're doing is creating a service that plays a movie for someone that is equally as good at predicting as what they want as Amazon showing next thing you should watch is. And that's potentially challenging. But it's a really big emerging area because the film industry was one of the last of the creative industries to really embrace AI and big data as kind of a viable strategy. A lot of film executives who I talked to in the mid 2010s were just like horribly resistant to the idea of ever having a data person on their team. And they all do now, but they're just a little behind because they started 10 years later than everyone else.
Try having that conversation with people in publishing.
I'm sure, yeah. So I know people probably have to bail. We're getting close to 7 o'clock, but this was a super fun conversation. The questions were great, and I really appreciate y'all tuning in and listening to me rant about math at Emerson. That doesn't happen often enough. Awesome.